This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the first in a new series of informational briefings on carbon capture, removal, transport, storage, and utilization that we call Carbon Management 101. The objective of this event is to provide an opportunity for reporters to increase their understanding of what they all mean, all of those terms. We think this will be helpful for reporters new to this topic and those covering it for a long time, and we have both groups on the line with us today. This event is sponsored by the Carbon Capture Coalition. My name is Ben Finzel. I'm the president of Renew PR, and I support the coalition's communications program. I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, I should note that this conversation is being recorded and will be posted online to serve as a resource for others. Today's briefing includes an all-star panel of representatives from leading conservation, environmental, business, and labor groups, including the National Wildlife Federation, Clean Air Task Force, Carbon Capture Inc., LanzaTech, LIUNA, and the Carbon Capture Coalition itself. I'll introduce each of our speakers in a few minutes. But first, I want to note that we will have Q&A opportunities after our Carbon Management 101 presentations on climate, carbon capture and removal, carbon transport, carbon storage and utilization, job creation, and economic impacts and bipartisan federal investments. You're welcome to start putting your questions in the Q&A or the chat box now, or you can wait until we begin the Q&A and ask them live if you prefer. So let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce Jessie Stolark, the Public Policy and Member Relations Manager for the Carbon Capture Coalition. Jessie.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. I'll just give a quick overview of the Carbon Capture Coalition and why we're engaged on this topic before I hand it back over to Ben to introduce our excellent panel. So the Carbon Capture Coalition brings to bear a politically diverse and significant group of companies, unions, as well as conservation and environmental policy organizations, all working to enable a supportive federal policy portfolio for the commercial scale deployment of carbon management technologies. So when we talk about carbon management, we're talking about this whole supply chain to capture or remove carbon, transport it, utilize it, or permanently store it. And we'll be learning more about these technologies today and how they are all working together in concert to commercialize the sector to meet diverse but common goals, including meeting mid-century climate goals, strengthening and decarbonizing domestic energy, industrial production and manufacturing, and retaining and expanding a high-wage job space. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand things back over to Ben. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Jessie. We look forward to hearing from you again at the end of our Carbon Management 101 presentations. But first, we have a lot of insight to share today. We're going to do our best to cover a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. So a word of warning, we're going to show you a lot of slides and there'll be a lot of charts and graphs and some small font. I apologize in advance. Two things to keep in mind. One, we'll be happy to go back to any of the slides during the Q&A. And two, we will share the slides with you after this call. So no worries about that. I'm going to introduce each person now in the order in which they'll speak so that I don't have to interrupt the flow of the presentations to introduce each one in turn. So they're just going to follow each other one after the other. First, we'll hear from Shannon Hike-Williams, Senior Director of Climate and Energy Policy for the National Wildlife Federation. She will be followed by John Thompson, Technology and Markets Director for Clean Air Task Force. He will be followed by Patricia Loria, Vice President of Business Development at Carbon Capture Incorporated. She'll be followed by Ben Grove, Staff Geoscientist at Clean Air Task Force, and Tom Dower, Vice President of Public Policy at LanzaTech. Next, we'll hear from Kevin Pranis, Marketing Manager for LIUNA, Minnesota and North Dakota. And finally, Jessie Stolark will join us again to talk about federal issues before we move on to the Q&A. That's a lot to cover, a word of warning. So let's get started. Shannon, over to you.
All right, and I'll speak a little quickly. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to kick off our panel presentations by putting carbon management in the context of our overall climate goals. So as you may know, the world's leading climate scientists, which form together the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, have continued to dial up the pressure on world leaders with each of their consensus-based reports. And they say that unless major policy actions are implemented in the context of the next several years to bring down carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions to net zero levels by mid-century, the world will have, unfortunately, little hope of stabilizing our climate and preventing the associated catastrophic effects, some of which, frankly, we're already starting to see today. This climate goal translates to limiting the planet's warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. And the IPCC analysis of the pathways to get to that 1.5 to 2 degree target points to obvious strategies, such as replacing fossil fuels with clean burning energy sources like wind and solar and geothermal power, using alternative fuels, electrifying transportation, boosting reforestation, and more. The IPCC also affirms the need for hundreds of gigatons of cumulative emissions reductions from industrial and power plant carbon capture and carbon removal by 2100. And in fact, the IPCC's most recent report from April clearly puts energy sector carbon capture in the set of solutions needed to meet climate goals and to foster the clean energy transition that we need. All right, next slide, Ben. And according to the International Energy Agency, who you see data here from, many pathways are actually needed to decarbonize the energy sector, including switching fuels, electrification, using hydrogen, and improving efficiency, and carbon capture, which you can see here as the darker blue wedge. The IPCC report also shows large use of carbon capture and storage in the industrial sector. In fact, up to about 2 gigatons is needed by 2030. And then also carbon dioxide removal, another strategy of drawing carbon directly out of the atmosphere or the air for storage or for use, is also needed to conquer historical emissions already driving warming and to also make up for gaps in other solutions. Next slide. This means that here in the US, we'll need to deploy a critical mass of carbon capture, direct air capture, and carbon reuse projects and related CO2 transport and storage infrastructure over the next decade. It's a pretty big challenge, but fortunately, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed late last year by Congress and now being implemented by the Biden administration, is getting a strong start on much of that infrastructure that's needed. And this slide here gives you a sense of the various components required for that full carbon management strategy that Ben and Jesse talked about. In all, we must pursue a three-pronged approach to getting to net zero, capturing and managing emissions from industry and power generation, offsetting the remaining emissions from hard to decarbonize sectors, and removing legacy emissions from the atmosphere with both technological approaches, like we're talking about here today, and also natural approaches that also groups like National Wildlife Federation are very fond of. Then those emissions can be transported from where they're captured or removed to where they can be permanently buried underground or reused in other products. Each of these strategies must be pursued, of course, in a just and equitable manner in order to ensure everyone can benefit from climate solutions and from all of these massive investments being made. Fortunately, each early science is showing that in addition to reducing carbon, many of these projects actually can reduce some other pollutants as well that are causing air pollution problems in our communities. But more research and monitoring is definitely needed, I would say, of actual projects as they're being implemented to make sure that this is a reality. And that concludes my comments. I think, John, we're over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. Let's go to the first slide, Ben. I want to talk about carbon capture, and Patricia, who will follow me, will be talking about direct air capture. So let me start my video here so that you can see me. This slide that you see describes the costs and the drivers for carbon capture at industrial and power sources. And what makes carbon capture economic is tax incentives, 45Q tax incentives. If they're high enough, projects get built, and if they don't, they just stay on the drawing board. The table that you see begins with ethanol, which is one of the most concentrated sources. Capture costs are not uniform across every industry. Those like ethanol that are highly concentrated are relatively inexpensive, and that's what you see in the final column there, about $37 to $55. And if you go down that table to something like gas plants, where it's maybe 3% of CO2 in the flue gas, it's much more expensive. And it really wasn't until 2018 that Congress raised 45Q levels to $50 a ton that we started to see movement, at least on these lower cost carbon capture items. So things like ethanol, ammonia, gas processing are really economic at that $50 a ton level. And so if you look at why we're suddenly seeing carbon capture projects, they're coming about because of these higher levels of 45Q. Prior to that, in 2009 to 2018, they were just too little. But hopefully in 2022, we'll see higher levels, if Congress chooses to adopt them, of say $85 a metric ton for saline storage and $35 or $60 for EOR and $85 for utilization. If those levels happen, what we will see is cement, refinery, steel, hydrogen, and other applications in the power sector beginning to take place. So on the next slide, you'll see sort of the universe of possible carbon capture projects across the United States. They range from ammonia and cement and chemicals to power and to ethanol and petrochemicals and pulp and paper. And what you see in the table is the different areas and how many projects there are. So this is if we can get the value of 45Q high enough, along with the work with the Investment Infrastructure Jobs Act, we have a real potential. Next slide, please. The near-term opportunities and medium-term opportunities cluster in these kind of circular areas, and you can kind of see about 900, almost 1,000 45Q eligible opportunities, and it really adds up. Into like, about half of those would be things that we could probably see happening in the next 10 years. And so if you kind of go to the next slide, what you see is that, the most common question I get is, well, does this stuff work? And the answer is carbon capture works. And we've had a track record now of about 50 years of successful deployment of commercial scale projects in the United States. And if you go to the next slide, Ben, you'll see that some of these began in 1972 with natural gas processing at the Val Verde site. We had in numerous of these low-cost things, but beginning with in 2014, we were starting to see climate-driven projects in the power sector, and also saline storage occurring on things like the Archer Daniels Midland Decatur ethanol facility. So if we go to the next slide, I think what I'd like to just summarize here is by saying that carbon management, which is carbon capture on industries and power plants, as well as direct air capture, is what we'll be talking about in the next speaker. These are really cost effective on a cost per ton basis. And some industrial projects are deploying now with the current level of $50. And we'll have many, many more projects if Congress chooses to raise that 45Q tax credit even higher. So if I go to the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the next stage, which is transportation. CO2 transport is a critical part of the infrastructure. In the United States, since the 1970s, we've built over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines, and it's operated for almost 50 years. Over that period of time, it's transported over 500 million metric tons of CO2. And this is a really well-established commercial endeavor. These pipelines have been around, they move a lot of stuff, and have really an impeccable safety record, probably far safer than pipelines that carry natural gas or oil. Is very comparable to other kinds of clean energy infrastructure like transmission lines. So this very safe record, never had a fatality, is not it's not as though there haven't been problems with pipelines, but we have this amazing safety record that we can build on, because we're going to have to, if we go to the next slide, focus on expanding this pipeline to network to handle the needs of decarbonizing this nation's economy by 2050. And so that means we have to expand by almost 20 to 30,000 miles. It means that we're going to have to get economies of scale on that, both in terms of the pipeline size and how much is moved from it. And we've actually got, through the enactment of the SCALE Act options in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, grants for storage, grants for transportation, all of which gives us a strong record to build on. And so with that, I think that concludes my remarks. And I'd like to introduce Patricia Loria to talk more about the direct air capture side of things.
Great, thank you. So yes, my name is Patricia Loria. I work for a company called Carbon Capture Inc. And I know there's carbon capture in our name, but we only do direct air capture. We are a technology and a project company out of LA in California. But let me kind of take this step back. If you want to go to the next slide, Ben, I'm here not necessarily to talk about us, but to talk about direct air capture in general, which is the process of using technology to separate carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. And this is in contrast to nature-based solutions, which are also very important carbon removal solutions. So this captured carbon can be stored underground, either via geological sequestration or mineralization, or converted to useful projects, and is an important part, as I think we've kind of heard a couple times, of the decarbonization pathway to stay below 1.5 degrees global warming. So you hear a lot that this is kind of a technology of the future, that it's something, we'll see in a decade or so. I would say that's not the case. There are already 19 kind of facilities that are doing direct air capture in the world. Most of these are kind of more pilots, so very small, but there are a couple kind of standouts, including the Orca facility, which opened in Iceland last year, which is a Climeworks facility. It is only storing 4,000 metric tons of CO2 per year, but Climeworks has announced plans for future plants that are also larger in size, and they got a $650 million round of investment in order to make that happen. Carbon Engineering and 1.5, their development partner, have plans for a 1 megaton facility in the Permian Basin, and that's an advanced development. And even us, a relative startup, plan to start sequestering CO2 in Wyoming next year and permanently sequestering it underground via Class 6 well, as Wyoming has primacy. Now, again, for us, that will be a small facility in year one, but we are choosing a location that has geological storage potential and land to get up to 5 megatons in 5 years. So these are things that are already happening today and tomorrow. So this isn't a technology of the future, it's a technology of today. If you want to go to the next slide, Ben. And we know that we need it. The IEA, the IPCC, everyone is saying that in order to stay below 1.5 degrees, we've already put too much CO2 in the atmosphere. So even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, and we know that that's absolutely not possible, we're still going to have to take CO2 out of the air to stay below 1.5 degrees global warming. So there is a real imperative to get this done. And we've certainly seen a lot of corporate support for that imperative. The likes of Microsoft and Stripe, the Frontier, Breakthrough Energy, they are all working with the direct air capture companies to try to deploy quickly so that we can get our costs down, because that's really what's going to get the cost down, doing a lot more of these projects. Next slide, Ben. And certainly we're excited about the bipartisan infrastructure law, which would give $3.5 billion to 4 regional DAC hubs. Then notice of intent came out for that last week. And certainly while we're excited about that, it's actually not looking at constructing facilities until later in the decade, so 2027 on. Whereas, as I've just shared, I think that the leading companies say we need to start getting started now. Corporate buyers say we need to start getting started now if we want to bring down the cost to below $100 a ton, which is the Department of Energy's kind of Earthshot initiative around direct air capture. In addition to actually building our technology, we're going to need a lot of low cost, zero carbon energy. Another reason why we're looking at Wyoming is that Wyoming is looking at an all of the above energy approach. So looking at nuclear, they've been putting in wind and solar. Now for our solution, and I would say other solutions probably like us, you actually require heat as well as energy, and certainly you can create heat out of energy. But things like even a concentrated solar or nuclear or geothermal are really good opportunities for that heat as well as as well as electricity. So I would say the DAC world is going to grow alongside kind of the zero cost, zero carbon energy sources. And that's this really exciting opportunity. As I said, just kind of one more point, Ben, certainly we're going to store that. There's the opportunity to store it in geological sequestration. Probably for this first generation of plants, you're going to see those sited really right on top of geological sequestration. But in order to get to that kind of many megatons or gigatons, we're going to need a lot of this same carbon management economy that point source is. We're going to need kind of this pipeline development as well, so that we can put our plants where we can get kind of good zero carbon energy and maybe store it in another location. So that CO2 transport infrastructure is going to be really important for how DAC looks, I would say, in the next 20 years. And so certainly we are excited about all the support that we've been given by the federal government for the direct air capture industry, but certainly looking for more exciting news to come out of states and local government as well. Now I'll pass it on to Ben.
Thank you. I'm Ben Grove with Clean Air Task Force. I'm going to be talking to you about carbon storage. So we've covered capture, transportation. Now what do we do with the captured carbon? So I want to give you an overview of how storage works. And geologic storage really provides a means of safely and permanently storing captured carbon deep within the subsurface. And storage typically occurs either in oil and gas bearing formations like depleted oil fields or saline aquifers. And we refer to this as saline storage. Saline storage really constitutes the vast majority of storage potential globally and particularly in the US. And the techniques for storing carbon in the subsurface are mature. They've been in practice since the 1970s. So this is no new territory for operators. And so storage really begins with geologic characterization. Geologists need to find a site that is appropriate and suitable for storing CO2. And that boils down to two main criteria. One, there needs to be a presence of a reservoir rock. So a saline aquifer, for instance, that has sufficient porosity to actually take the injected CO2 and store it. And then the second key criteria is a cap rock. So this is directly above the reservoir rock. This is a confining unit, an impermeable rock layer that inhibits CO2 from migrating, thus effectively trapping it in place. If you look to the figure on the right, I'm mentioning deep formations. I want to give you a sense of scale. This is kind of just represents a hypothetical project. Oftentimes projects are targeting injection zones that are about a mile deep in the subsurface. So you see on the right here, an injection well injecting into an injection zone. You see the impermeable seal above it. And I just want you to notice the amount of geologic strata in between this storage complex and underlying drinking water aquifers and the surface. There's also superimposed here some well-known buildings from across the world to give you a better sense of scale, but we're talking very deep injection. Could you go to the next slide, please? So the way I like to think about geologic storage is, simply put, we're essentially returning carbon to where it came from. We're capturing emissions that would otherwise go to the atmosphere. And this carbon, in many instances, came from the subsurface originally. And so what is the storage potential in the US? If we focus just on saline storage, so saline aquifers in the US, the potential is absolutely enormous and really represents a long-term and large-scale climate solution. If I have to put a number on it, the estimates of domestic saline storage capacity represent over 1,000 years worth of US annual CO2 emissions. So we have the storage potential. How is it regulated? Then EPA regulates and permits geologic storage under its underground injection control program. And the purpose of this program is to protect underground sources of drinking water. I won't go into a lot of details in this. I'm happy to follow up at any point with any one of you if you would like more details. But essentially, if an operator wants to pursue saline storage, they need a Class 6 well. And the requirements for this require significant site characterization, monitoring of the injected CO2 plume, monitoring at the surface, reporting and verification, all to demonstrate secure storage and continued monitoring after the site has been closed. And if you go to the next slide, please. With that, I'd like to just give a brief historical perspective of storage operations. I touched on this already, but the techniques for and methods for safely and permanently injecting CO2 in the subsurface are well understood, and they've been in commercial practice for many decades now. And when we talk about risks associated with CO2 storage, the actual risks of volumes of CO2 leaking from a storage complex, provided it's properly characterized site, are exceedingly small. And these risks really continue to decline after initial injection. There's significant amounts of data that are collected during operations to ensure that risk management is obviously a key priority. To give you some real world examples of saline storage projects, the Sleipner project in Norway was really the first commercial saline storage project that began in 1996. It's successfully stored over approximately 1 million tons of CO2 per year. And closer to home, John mentioned this earlier, in Decatur, Illinois, there is a project capturing CO2 from an ethanol plant and sequestering it in the Illinois basin, the Mount Simon Sandstone. This project recently released their monitoring data to the public. The final report shows that there are no indications of leakage from the storage complex. And next slide. So I'd like to end here with just talking about where this industry is kind of going. There's a public perception now that CO2 storage projects are really targeting enhanced oil recovery and will perpetuate production of fossil fuels. CATF tracks announced projects.
Draft. Legislative draft.
You know, a lot of stories.
Could someone please mute their mic, please?
Draft. It's not going anywhere in the Senate.
Yeah, well,
Kelly,
the mansion yet know that he's in charge of that.
Kelly's on mic.
Thursday before the Hoyer made the announcement that.
Sorry, I just want to be sure everyone can hear me before.
You are the chairman.
You have to unmute again, Ben.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Ben, can we hear you?
There we go. You can hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So I'll breeze through this quickly. As I was saying, that there's a public perception that CCS projects are targeting enhanced oil recovery to perpetuate fossil fuel production. And CATF tracks projects that have been announced, CCS projects that have been announced since the 2018 reform of 45Q. And the data suggests the complete opposite. Over 70% of the more than 90 projects that have been announced since 2018 are targeting saline storage. And saline storage really represents a much larger opportunity for storage capacity, and the tax credit incentives are higher for saline storage. We expect this trend to continue, and we're seeing that companies and investors are shifting to saline geologic storage. And I'd just quickly end on a note that scaling up the development and permitting of saline storage is going to be really key for achieving industrial deep decarbonization. Out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there were carbon management provisions that specifically aim to aid EPA and states with primacy for permitting Class 6 wells. So excited to see that these projects will continue to ramp up. I'm going to turn it over to a colleague Tom now, who's going to talk about the other end use of the CO2 utilization.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. And special hello to Doug, who I haven't seen in a long time. So good to see your name here. I'm Tom Dower with LanzaTech. Really quickly, LanzaTech is a carbon transformation company. We recycle waste carbon in its many forms through gas fermentation. So we essentially want to replace fossil fuels with waste carbon for the products that will continue, even in a low carbon world, to require carbon as their basic building blocks, which is essentially carbon utilization. Okay, Ben, first slide. So you've heard a lot about carbon sequestration. We've heard about carbon capture from industrial sources, from power plants, and direct air capture from the atmosphere. The question remains, what do you do with that carbon once it's captured? Carbon sequestration is obviously a necessary means of really getting at scale massive amounts of carbon that would otherwise be in the atmosphere. But carbon utilization is also a really important part of carbon management. So it's really a complement. It's not meant to, these don't compete with each other. We sort of need all of it. And carbon utilization technologies and business models are really to capture carbon oxides, so carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide emissions, and produce low carbon fuels, chemicals, materials, and products, all things that will remain in our lives. And I really sometimes feel like decarbonization is a bit of a misnomer, because some things will never be decarbonized. They will always have carbon in them. And so we're really talking about what's the best way to use carbon to produce those goods and materials. As Shannon mentioned earlier, actually, carbon utilization can also offer benefits to communities that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution. You know, in many cases, we can avoid secondary combustion at industrial facilities by capturing energy and carbon-rich gases that would otherwise be combusted either through a flare or through other use, including more inefficient uses such as heat and steam and electricity production on site, which with an increasingly clean grid could be made up with clean electricity. So the next slide, please. So the question is, I get that this a lot, is this real? Are these technologies real? Will this make a real impact? And it absolutely will. I mean, from LanzaTech's perspective, we're really focusing on hard to abate sectors and really trying to get at, there's a good proportion of oil, natural gas liquids that are going into non-fuel needs, such as plastics and other polyesters, many things that are part of our daily lives. So the estimates of future carbon utilization markets are in at least the tens of billions of dollars in the near term and well over $1 trillion over the long term, and really helping consumer-facing goods reduce their carbon emissions and letting consumers have a choice between a fossil-based product and one that is actually using and recycling carbon and creating a circular economy. And so, we have seen increased understanding. I'd say it almost feels like carbon utilization for non-enhanced oil recovery. Okay, so I'm not talking about producing more oil. I'm talking about using carbon to produce other things that are made from oil. We've seen just a growing interest in that, both from Congress, from the administration. It was in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as was mentioned earlier. The 45Q tax credits, there's conversations about increasing values there as well to deploy more projects, and growing recognition that in order to get to a net zero economy and a truly sustainable circular economy, we're still going to need carbon-based goods, and really questioning how to get that carbon and put it to its highest, most efficient use. With that, I'll end and turn it over to our next speaker, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the chance to be here. My name is Kevin Pranis, representing LIUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America. We represent 500,000 members in the United States and Canada, of whom a large majority are construction laborers employed on building, roads, bridges, transit, water, sewer, and stormwater, and energy infrastructure projects. Our energy work includes conventional and nuclear power plants and wind and solar generation, and refineries, pipelines, and associated facilities that produce, transport, and store gas and liquid fuels. In Minnesota, where I work, about 20% of our 13,000 members work on facilities and infrastructure that rely on fossil fuels, including the pipelines and distribution lines, refineries and ethanol plants, coal and gas-fired power plants, and other industrial facilities. And one thing it's important to understand, and I think you get that from the first slide here, is that the industries associated with high levels of direct and indirect carbon emissions aren't just a significant source of jobs in Minnesota and elsewhere. They're also a significant source of high-quality jobs that provide middle-class wages along with health and retirement benefits that sustain families and communities. And we're here because carbon management provides opportunities to both address climate change and position our industries to be competitive in a low carbon world, while retaining many of these jobs and creating new jobs in retrofitting facilities and building new infrastructure to help us manage carbon. I think it's important to understand that many blue collar workers, not only our members, but fellow trades, other blue collar workers who work in manufacturing and other aspects of energy and manufacturing, carbon intensive economies, are trying to understand what climate action and energy transition means for them. Wind, solar, and battery storage are key technologies, and they're technologies our members work on, but they're only partial solutions. and that's partial solutions with respect to their solving the climate problems, the technologies that batteries and electricity alone don't solve. They're also partial solutions when it comes to jobs and what those job opportunities are going to be. And so we see this as a chance to put not only laborers, ironworkers, and operating engineers and electricians who might work on wind and solar, but also our members who work in piped facilities and thermal plants, along with boilermakers, pipe fitters, and other crafts with specialized skills that can be put to work capturing carbon from chemical processes and from energy generation that can't easily be replaced. And there's some excellent research that the Great Plains Institute and the Carbon Capture Coalition have put out that talk about how many jobs can be saved by installing these technologies and how many additional jobs can be created from everything from installing carbon capture to building the transportation, the pipeline systems to move caption to building the injection sites. So our union and others have been involved in identifying those opportunities, supporting responsible development of industry, and making sure the clean energy economy jobs of the future are as good and as available to local workers as jobs in the conventional energy economy have been. And that's always a challenge. Every time there's a transition, workers often get lost in the shuffle, but we're seeing progress. And for example, Navigator, one of the large proposed pipeline projects to move carbon dioxide, has already partnered with union labor so that we make sure that the same workers who safely build fossil fuel pipelines can start working on pipelines that provide climate solutions. So appreciate the time and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you to all of our excellent speakers. Before we get to your questions, so I hope you're formulating them. I will just quickly recap the policy landscape and just very quickly touch on how the current political environment impacts this issue in particular. So as we are all very well aware, the makeup of the 117th Congress is very unique. We have a Senate that is controlled by Democrats by the slimmest of margins, 50-50, making passing any bill without broad bipartisan support incredibly difficult. Democrats also control the House, also by a very small margin. However, House rules do not require the supermajority vote threshold of the Senate, making it a bit easier to advance partisan measures through the lower chamber. So while the partisan divide in Congress is strong, carbon capture policies have been and remain an area of significant bipartisan agreement. And we've seen tremendous bipartisan support for carbon management over the past year and a half in particular. So following the 2018 reform and expansion of the federal Section 45Q tax credit, which is the cornerstone federal policy for carbon management project deployment, there has been a significant and intentional uptick in the introduction of bipartisan federal legislation pertaining to carbon management. This is reflective of the fact that while the 45Q tax credit is foundational, we will need a broad suite of enabling policies to commercialize the sector. And I just wanted to add that the 45Q tax credit is a performance-based tax credit, meaning that projects must demonstrate through monitoring, verification, and reporting that the CO2 has been stored in appropriate geologic formations or converted to a useful product. So in 2020, oh, can you go back, Ben? Sorry. In 2021 alone, we saw how a coordinated effort around a comprehensive suite of carbon management policies made our agenda a force to be reckoned with on the Capitol Hill, whether through the bipartisan infrastructure law or through the budget reconciliation package. Now you can go to the next slide. So this brings me to the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Investments and Jobs Act, which was signed last November. Some of our speakers have already touched on the significance of the bill, but I'll just quickly recap. So the bipartisan infrastructure law included historic funding levels for critical 2020 Energy Act authorizations, and it contains approximately $12 billion for carbon management demonstration and commercialization activities over a 5-year period. This includes nearly $1 billion for large-scale pilot projects and $2.5 billion for commercial demonstration projects at the newly formed Department of Energy Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. Additionally, the bill provides appropriations for several programs that were authorized by the 2020 Energy Act, including the Carbon Utilization Program. It also fully funds the Storing CO2 and Lowering Emissions Act, or SCALE Act, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then last, but certainly not least, and Patricia already touched on this, but for the first time, the bill establishes 4 regional direct air capture hubs, which should be capable of capturing 1 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And we view this as a much needed federal investment to commercially deploy and put us on the track to begin building the DAC industry to the scale required by climate goals. So this package which is now law, has transformative measures to enable the wide-scale deployment of carbon management technologies. And while this is only one piece of the larger puzzle, it is an incredible victory for the entire sector. You can go to the next slide, Ben. So as I mentioned earlier, the SCALE Act was also included in the bipartisan infrastructure law in its entirety. It provides $4.6 billion over the 5-year authorization period for financing for CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. And it is modeled after other successful federal private infrastructure financing mechanisms. This will allow us to move from a source sink model where CO2 is captured and transported from single sources to appropriate storage or utilization points to a hubs model where CO2 is captured from a variety of sources and then transported for storage or utilization. Additionally, the SCALE Act ensures that states and EPA have the resources they need to meet the anticipated demand for Class 6 well permits, which are what governs CO2 storage, monitoring, verification, and reporting at the EPA. So this is historic. The SCALE Act was just introduced last December and was passed this past fall, or excuse me, it was introduced 2 Decembers ago. It was passed this past fall, less than 1 year from introduction to passage. You can go to the next slide, Ben. So this brings me to the tax-based priorities, which we kind of call enhancements to 45Q. So prior to the December holidays, the House of Representatives passed a version of budget reconciliation language that included critical enhancements to the 45Q program. And these have also been included in the Senate bill. And they include a multi-year extension of the commenced construction window, which would provide carbon capture, direct air capture, or carbon utilization projects that commence construction before January 1st, 2032 to qualify for 45Q. It would also provide direct pay, which direct pay would provide the option of the full value of the tax credit for the full 12 years available to claim the credits. So if you're not familiar with direct pay, it is essentially an overpayment of taxes on your annual tax filing and allows project developers to sidestep costly tax equity partnerships. Additionally, many companies or project developers do not have enough tax liability to access the tax credit. It also contains enhanced credit values for industry and power. It increases the values to $85 per metric tons for industrial facilities and power plants that store captured CO2 in saline geologic formations, as well as $60 per metric ton for carbon utilization and $60 a ton for EOR storage. It also increases the credit values for direct air capture to $180 per metric ton for those projects seeking to securely store captured CO2 in saline geologic formations, $130 for carbon utilization, and $130 for EOR storage. And then last but not least, it dramatically reduces arbitrary capture thresholds which are contained in the current iteration of 45Q. And the coalition maintains these thresholds serve no policy purpose. So that's just a very quick tour of the policy landscape to date. And kind of these 2 critical pieces and how they fit together. But I want to turn it back over to Ben, and so we can get to your questions.
Well, thank you, Jesse, and all of our speakers. I wasn't kidding when I said that was a lot of slides and a lot of information. It's a big field and a growing field, as we heard from Patricia and Tom and from everyone. But we do have time for questions now. And fortunately, several of you have already started putting them in the chat box. So I'm going to start with those. And then certainly we'll have time for more. The first is from Carlos at E&E News Politico. On a practical level, how should the Energy Department and developers of carbon capture projects engage with environmental justice advocates? How can environmental justice communities help to shape where carbon capture projects are sited? I don't know who wants to go first with that, but chime in.
Give a start. All right, am I on camera? Okay. Yes, hi. So good question. And I would say, primarily the onus should be on the Department of Energy and other stakeholders to really make sure that environmental justice communities or any other really affected community is brought into the process. But I appreciate the point of the question to make sure that environmental justice and local impacts are really considered in these projects. I would say, there's some major points to ensure that DOE is on the right path, and hopefully we'll be hearing even more from them in the near future on their approach. There's already been one guidance document from the Council on Environmental Quality with regards to incorporating environmental justice in carbon management activities. So that's so I would just refer you to that. I can look up the link in just a minute and put it in the chat. which really shows a good indication of the direction, at least overall, of the administration on this, even with regards to carbon capture. But anyway, my point being, obviously monitoring, reporting, verification will be hugely important in any of these kinds of projects. There's, for a lot of communities, not a ton of trust there when it comes to anything that, as someone else mentioned, might have the appearance of being built on the backbone of fossil fuel infrastructure or otherwise furthering the fossil fuel industry, which of course we don't think this area does, this type of infrastructure or industry does, but there's certainly that fear. So transparency in data to show benefit and to show what these projects are all about will be critical. Community engagement, invitation, involvement in the process early and often, including where to even site projects. And then when it comes to tribes, obviously making sure to respect and adhere to tribal sovereignty and what kind of limits that might put on where a project would go. And then another thing just to consider is often we talk, including in the environmental community, about overall economic benefits of a lot of these climate solutions, but we need to think in more granular detail about what that means. We can't just have overall economic benefit from these, but actually local economic opportunity, job opportunities. So that means local hiring, training, bringing people in from fence line communities and giving them an opportunity in these new industries.
If I could just pick up on that, I mean, I think those are exactly the right areas to focus on. I think in two areas. One, it's the companies that are bringing forth these projects. It's their responsibility first and foremost to do that engagement, to understand what the concerns are and what the asks are of them. I think it's really important that these be localized, right? I'd say there's two types of sort of environmental justice issues we hear about. One's based on very localized impacts that can be addressed through siting, through mitigation, through efforts to engage economically. Oh, sorry. I don't know why my camera's off. And then I think you hear some sort of very generalized critiques. And I think the important thing is to engage with those communities that actually are nearby, both environmental justice and other communities and stakeholders, to make sure that you're building that social license by delivering benefits, answering questions, and adopting mitigation strategies. And I think that local permitting processes are often a good venue for that. If you see public utility or public service commission processes, you see this also. This is not new to CO2 pipelines. You see this with other sorts of, whether it's conventional pipelines, where there's a process that attempts to address many of these concerns and results in substantial mitigations, often substantial benefits to those communities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And I think that that's the level at which it mostly happens more than the federal level.
And that was Kevin Pranis from Lyuna speaking. His camera is not functioning. So if you were wondering who the disembodied voice was and you want to quote some of his smart content, that was Kevin. Anyone else want to chime in before I move on to the next question?
I'll throw something in as kind of a project developer perspective. Certainly I've talked about some of the reasons why we're looking at Wyoming. Their Class 6 primacy is certainly one of them. They're focused on clean energy. But we have heard that there's government support for looking at states that are transitioning from a fossil fuel extractive economy to a clean energy economy. And we really kind of feel that in Wyoming, that the governor's office, the Wyoming Business Council, others want to help their state kind of transition into the future. And so yeah, we are developing a community engagement board that's really going to talk about how do we make sure there are kind of community benefits for that state. For a state like Wyoming, who has maybe more animals than people, it's a lot of thinking about kind of migration corridors for animals and where we're building. Can we build on disturbed land that's already been used for mining or other things rather than pristine land? But yeah, I think that there has been hopefully this shift, and that each project is looking to do those community engagement boards, and that certainly government funding will almost be dependent on that. And we're kind of happy to be working in that type of environment.
Good, thank you. I want to move on. We have two more questions and we have a hand up as well, so I want to make sure we get to everything. Carlos asked a follow-up question. A CO2 pipeline ruptured in Satarsha, Mississippi in 2020. Was that an anomaly?
Ben, sure. Why don't I take that question? Great. I get this question a lot, and it's a fair one to ask. So the situation in Mississippi was that lots of rains, a rupture on a pipeline, lots of CO2 released, no deaths, but a lot of other serious kinds of conditions, enough CO2 to stop certain cars from functioning, and some people got quite sick. I do think that was the exception and not to what we've seen over 50 years. And I guess the thing I would just say is that over 50 years, we've moved 500 million metric tons of CO2 over 5,000 pipelines and never had a fatality. I think that doesn't mean we rest on our laurels, but when you look at the overall safety record of CO2 pipelines, it's as good as any infrastructure for clean energy that's out there. It's as good as transmission lines, maybe even better. So I think that as we look towards building out the amount of CO2 pipelines to meet our mid-century needs, we've got to build on this safety record. We've got to find ways of providing more funding for inspections. We've got to train local responders to how to deal with CO2. But we have a far better track record to build on than just about any other kind of clean energy infrastructure.
Thank you, John. Anyone else want to chime in quickly before I move on? We have hands up. No, okay. So Craig Bettenhausen from ACS asked a question which Tom has answered in the chat. Yay, Tom. And I would also point out that both Shannon and Jesse have put links to CEQ guidance statements in the chat. So please be sure to check those out as well. Now, Siri Hadreen from S&P Global, you had a question. You want to turn your mic on and ask it.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks. I couldn't figure out where the conversation was. My question, it's again going back to pipelines. My understanding is the permitting of pipelines and regulation of carbon dioxide pipelines is sort of a gray area. And I saw that in Minnesota last week, they kind of asserted authority over that. I was wondering if someone could comment on that. Is that something that maybe would need to be regulated by FERC, or is there room for improvement there?
Kevin Pranis, I can speak to part of that. I think actually Minnesota was sort of the exception. It's my understanding the other states where I'm aware that there's development going on, CO2 pipelines are already regulated along with other pipelines by state level commissions, public utility commissions or the equivalent. And so Minnesota, the statute was, I'd say, not super well drafted, and the rules were sort of narrower, appeared to be narrower, and not necessarily to apply to CO2 pipelines. So the question came to the commission with two proposed projects in Minnesota. We supported commission regulation. We think that it makes sense to have statewide regulation of the routing. That's just of the routing. PHMSA, the Federal Pipeline Safety Agency, already regulates CO2 pipelines. It has for many years. And so I don't think there's actually a regulatory gap. I think it was just a new kind of technology that had not been permitted before in Minnesota, and it raised some questions. And I think now those questions have substantially been answered.
Thank you, Kevin. Anyone else want to add into that? Okay, I'm going to go to Doug Obie from Inside EPA. Doug, you had your hand up as well. Turn your mic on.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to come back to Capitol Hill for a second and ask, there was a slide earlier that talked about remaining priorities in the reconciliation bill. I interpreted that, rightly or wrongly, as pending items that are in either the House or Senate bill. I was just wondering if you could quickly clarify where those numbers come from for, Build Back Better or its successor, Building a Better America, whatever we're calling it. And my question is basically this. I know people hate to prognosticate, but I guess I'm asking you to prognosticate and say, what's the outlook for this stuff actually moving? And if stasis continues to be the rule as it has been for months, if that continues to be the case, are you concerned that some of the CCS incentives that you're endorsing here could get sort of go down the tube with it if Congress just can't agree and they can't get the votes to do something on climate writ large? Thanks.
Who would like to go first?
I can go first, Ben, to kind of provide the overview, and then if others want to clean up after me. So I would say that we right now are feeling fairly optimistic. I think what we're hearing reporting out from the Senate is that Senator Manchin has indicated that he's kind of ready to start re-engaging on reconciliation efforts. But what we do understand is that it's very clear that the size and the scope of the package are going to be reduced. So the good news for carbon management is that the climate and energy portions, and specifically the tax credit, the energy tax credits that are in both the House and the Senate budget reconciliation packages in the last iteration, they're both the most well-negotiated pieces as well as some of the most attainable pieces of the bill. And so we're fully anticipating that whatever does move forward, that those elements are retained, as things go forward. And so I know there's some questions and prognosticating around timeline, but again, what we hear is that things are happening, even if they are slow, and that they are working to get things going, hopefully by the July 4th recess.
Thank you, Jesse. And Doug, did you have a follow-up question before anyone else chimes in?
Yeah, I just wanted that answers sort of the first part of my question and part of the second, but if they don't get something, I guess let me reframe this a little bit. There's bipartisan support for the carbon sequestration provisions. I get that. There's a lot of bipartisan support for that. But if they can't get votes for other elements of the package, how worried are you where essentially some of the legislators that are a little bit more skeptical of CCS or are getting pressure from, from EJ or folks or people who are less concerned about this, who say, well, we didn't get our climate provision. We didn't get what we wanted. Therefore, you lawmaker X should just not support CCS. We don't want a CCS only bill after all of this. So I don't know if you had any thoughts as to how likely that scenario is to happen if we don't get progress by July. Thanks.
I'm happy to jump in, Jesse, rather than leave it all to you. Doug, it's a great question. A couple thoughts. One, yes, very bipartisan history here. I think we stand well in both categories, regardless of who's in charge, sort of thing. The other is we're talking about changing existing tax credits. So then if we end up in like a tax extender sort of situation, I think that puts the 45Q changes in the best situation versus many of the others. Some of the others, like hydrogen, for example, those are new. It gets very challenging to think about legislative pathways that are not through budget reconciliation that could happen for new ones, unless an extenders is more than extenders at the end of the year. And I do think the impetus for all of the whole climate and energy package is about climate. And it would really be surprising, shocking, highly disappointing if folks in one camp didn't get everything they wanted on climate, so they would stop other things that impact the climate. I think that is less likely a scenario because we need it all, and we need it very quickly, right? And this is the crucial decade. So I can't prognosticate on when or if any of this stuff is going to happen, but I think there's a really strong argument to let as much go as possible. And actually, I think from the left, folks have been pretty willing to go pretty far, maybe to places that they haven't been comfortable because they understand the climate imperative so desperately.
Thank you, Tom. It is now 2:00, so we do need to wrap up. Just wanted to share resources for more information. CarbonCaptureCoalition.org, as I'm sure you all know. Also CarbonCaptureReady.org, which is a GPI site that has state level information. And then also there are state fact sheets on that website as well, which are really useful if you're looking at specific states. And then finally, the Clean Air Task Force projects database is super awesome and very useful. There's a link to it there. We'll also make sure we follow up with that, but that's a good resource for you to keep. Want to thank you all for joining us today for this conversation about carbon management. We hope this initial discussion will be helpful to your ongoing reporting. If you have additional questions that we didn't get to, or you want to interview any of our speakers today, get in touch with me. I think you all know my email address. It's ben@renewpr.com, and I will happily follow up with you. As we wrap up today, please join me in thanking our guest speakers, Shannon Hike-Williams, John Thompson, Patricia Loria, Ben Grove, Tom Dower, Kevin Pranis, and Jesse Stolark. Thanks again for joining us today. Be well, be safe, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.